Have you ever wondered what lengths someone might go to for a fresh start? What if I told you that in 1989, a carefully orchestrated funeral brought together dozens of mourners, complete with tears, flowers, and heartfelt eulogies, but the casket they were burying was empty? What if I told you that the man they were mourning was very much alive, watching from a distance as his own memorial service unfolded? And what if I told you that this elaborate deception netted the conspirators $2.7 million, only to unravel 34 years later because of a single typing error on a death certificate? This is the story of Michael Hendricks and Thomas Brennan, two men whose partnership in deception would span decades, fool federal investigators, and ultimately collapse due to the most mundane of clerical mistakes. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand how a fake funeral became the centerpiece of one of the most audacious insurance frauds in American history, and how the very document meant to legitimize their scheme became the key to their downfall. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. In the autumn of 1988, 26-year-old Michael Hendricks found himself drowning in debt. His small construction business in Portland, Oregon, had collapsed under the weight of unpaid invoices and equipment loans. Credit cards maxed out, his truck repossessed, and facing eviction from his apartment, Michael saw no way forward. His girlfriend had left him months earlier, citing his financial instability and increasingly erratic behavior. Friends avoided his calls, knowing they would inevitably lead to requests for money he could never repay. It was during this lowest point that Michael reconnected with Thomas Brennan, a man 30 years his senior, who had served as a mentor figure during Michael's troubled teenage years. Thomas, now 62, presented himself as a successful businessman with interests in real estate and import operations. What Michael didn't initially understand was that Thomas's wealth came from a very different source, one built on carefully constructed lies and exploitation of bureaucratic weaknesses. Thomas had been watching Michael's descent with calculated interest. He recognized in the young man's desperation an opportunity, and in his naivety, a perfect partner. During a meeting at a downtown diner in November 1988, Thomas presented Michael with what he called a business proposition. The older man explained that insurance companies, particularly those dealing with life policies, operated on predictable patterns. They processed claims based on documentation, rarely conducting thorough investigations for amounts under certain thresholds. More importantly, they relied heavily on death certificates issued by local authorities, documents that were surprisingly easy to manipulate for someone with the right connections. Thomas had spent years cultivating relationships with low-level clerks in various municipal offices. A combination of small bribes, fabricated emergencies, and exploitation of overworked staff had given him access to official forms and stamps. He explained to Michael that with the proper preparation, they could stage a death, collect substantial life insurance payouts, and disappear with enough money to start completely new lives. The plan Thomas outlined was both sophisticated and brutally simple. Michael would take out multiple life insurance policies with different companies, each for amounts just below the threshold that would trigger intensive investigation. The policies would be spread across several states, with beneficiaries listed as shell companies Thomas had established over the years. After a waiting period to avoid suspicion, they would stage Michael's death in a way that would be difficult for investigators to verify. Michael's initial reaction was revulsion. The idea of faking his own death seemed not just illegal, but morally reprehensible. He thought about his elderly parents, who would be devastated by news of his passing. He considered the friends who, despite avoiding his recent calls, still cared about him. Thomas listened patiently to these objections, then systematically dismantled them. The older man pointed out that Michael's parents had already written him off as a failure. His mother had stopped taking his calls, and his father had made it clear that he expected nothing from his son. Thomas suggested that Michael's death might actually provide them with closure, sparing them the ongoing disappointment of watching their son's continued failures. As for friends, Thomas argued that people who abandoned someone during hard times deserved no consideration. More persuasively, Thomas painted a picture of Michael's future without intervention. The debts would only grow larger. Bankruptcy would destroy any chance of legitimate recovery. Michael would spend the next decade working minimum-wage jobs, living in squalor, never able to rebuild what he had lost. The fake death, Thomas argued, was not just an escape but a rebirth. With proper new identity documents, which Thomas assured him he could arrange, Michael would have a genuine fresh start with substantial resources. Over several weeks of meetings, Thomas gradually wore down Michael's resistance. The older man provided examples of similar schemes he claimed to know about, though he never admitted direct involvement. He showed Michael newspaper clippings about insurance payouts that had gone unquestioned. He produced official-looking documents that demonstrated how easy it was to obtain death certificates with minor modifications to standard forms. The turning point came in December 1988, when Michael received an eviction notice giving him 30 days to vacate his apartment. That evening, he called Thomas and agreed to proceed with the plan. The older man's satisfaction was carefully concealed, but he immediately began outlining the specific steps they would need to take. First, Michael would need to establish a pattern of depression and suicidal ideation. This would be accomplished through strategic conversations with acquaintances, journal entries that would be discovered later, and consultation with a therapist who would document his mental state. Thomas explained that insurance companies were more likely to pay claims quickly when dealing with apparent suicides, as the circumstances discouraged prolonged investigation. Simultaneously, Michael would apply for life insurance policies. Thomas provided him with detailed instructions about how to complete applications, what medical information to provide, and how to answer questions about his mental health honestly while avoiding red flags. The older man had researched companies that were known for processing claims efficiently and had identified optimal coverage amounts. The insurance application process took 3 months. Michael visited medical offices for required examinations, submitted to blood tests, and answered detailed questionnaires about his health, lifestyle, and family history. Thomas coached him through each step, ensuring that his responses were consistent across all applications. The older man had prepared cover stories for any discrepancies that might arise, and had even arranged for Michael to establish new banking relationships that would appear normal to insurance investigators. During this period, Michael began documenting his supposed mental decline. He started seeing a therapist, Dr. Margaret Collins, and during their sessions he gradually revealed increasing feelings of hopelessness and worthlessness. Dr. Collins, a well-meaning professional, took his statements at face value and began prescribing antidepressants while encouraging him to consider more intensive treatment. Her notes, which would later become crucial evidence, documented a clear progression toward what appeared to be serious suicidal ideation. By March 1989, all the insurance policies were in place. Michael had successfully obtained coverage totaling $2.7 million from 6 different companies. The policies were structured so that no single company was exposed to more than $600,000, an amount Thomas had determined would not trigger intensive investigation. Each policy listed different shell companies as beneficiaries, companies that Thomas controlled through a complex web of paperwork that would take investigators months to unravel. The final phase of preparation involved selecting the method and location for Michael's apparent death. Thomas had considered several options, including a staged drowning, a car accident in a remote location, and a hiking mishap in the mountains. After extensive research, he settled on a plan that would involve Michael apparently falling from a bridge into a fast-moving river during a severe storm. The location Thomas selected was the Willamette River Bridge during Oregon's notorious winter storm season. The bridge stood 200 feet above churning waters that had claimed legitimate victims over the years. Most importantly, the river's current was strong enough that bodies were often carried miles downstream, sometimes never recovered. Thomas had studied newspaper archives and found dozens of cases where people who jumped or fell from the bridge were presumed dead based solely on witness testimony and recovered personal belongings. The timing would be crucial. They needed a night with severe weather conditions that would limit visibility and discourage prolonged search efforts. Thomas monitored weather forecasts obsessively, looking for the perfect combination of heavy rain, strong winds, and darkness. He also needed to ensure that there would be at least one credible witness to Michael's apparent jump. For this element of the plan, Thomas recruited an unwitting accomplice. Margaret Torres was a 43-year-old night shift nurse who drove across the Willamette River Bridge twice daily during her commute. Thomas had observed her routine for weeks, noting that she always took the same route at precisely the same times. Through careful research, he learned that Margaret was a devout Catholic who took her civic responsibilities seriously. She had previously called police to report suspicious activities and had once stopped to help accident victims. Thomas's plan required Margaret to witness Michael's apparent suicide without realizing she was part of an elaborate deception. On the chosen night, March 15, 1989, Thomas positioned himself near the bridge approach while Michael waited in predetermined locations. The storm that evening was particularly severe, with winds gusting over 40 miles per hour and rainfall reducing visibility to less than 50 yards. At exactly 11:23 p.m., as Margaret's vehicle approached the bridge, Michael appeared to stumble onto the roadway in apparent distress. His clothing was disheveled, his hair soaked, and his movement suggested someone in severe emotional crisis. Margaret slowed her vehicle as she observed what appeared to be a man in obvious psychological distress climbing over the bridge railing. What Margaret witnessed next would haunt her for years. She saw Michael release his grip and disappear into the darkness below. She immediately pulled over, activated her emergency flashers, and called 911 from her cellular phone. Her report to the emergency dispatcher was detailed and consistent. She described seeing a young man, approximately 6 feet tall with dark hair, wearing jeans and a dark jacket, deliberately jump from the bridge. The response was swift but limited by the weather conditions. Portland police and Coast Guard units arrived within 20 minutes, but the storm made immediate search efforts impossible. Officers found Michael's wallet, keys, and a handwritten note on the bridge walkway, exactly where Thomas had placed them after Michael's apparent jump. The note, written in Michael's handwriting weeks earlier, expressed profound regret about his financial failures and apologized to anyone who might be hurt by his decision. The initial police report classified the incident as an apparent suicide. The combination of witness testimony, recovered personal effects, and documented history of depression created a compelling narrative that required minimal investigation. The storm conditions provided a reasonable explanation for why no body had been recovered immediately. Meanwhile, Michael was very much alive, hiding in a cabin Thomas had rented 50 miles outside Portland under a false name. The older man had prepared the location weeks in advance, stocking it with food, clothing, and everything Michael would need during the initial phase of his new identity. Thomas visited daily, bringing supplies and monitoring news reports about the search efforts. The search for Michael's body continued for 6 days. Coast Guard boats covered a 20-mile stretch of the Willamette River, while volunteer teams walked the shoreline looking for any trace of the missing man. the efforts were hampered by continued bad weather and the river's notorious currents. On March 21st, authorities officially suspended the active search, though they maintained that the case would remain open pending recovery of remains. Dr. Margaret Collins was contacted by police as part of their routine investigation. Her therapy notes provided crucial corroborating evidence of Michael's mental state in the weeks before his apparent death. She described a patient who had shown clear signs of severe depression, social withdrawal, and increasing references to suicide as a solution to his problems. Her professional assessment supported the conclusion that Michael had taken his own life. Thomas began filing insurance claims within days of the search being suspended. He had prepared detailed packages for each insurance company, including copies of the police report, witness statements, therapy records, and newspaper coverage of the incident. The claims were submitted through the shell companies he had established, each with legitimate business addresses and phone numbers he controlled. The insurance companies' responses varied, but none conducted extensive independent investigations. The combination of official police documentation, credible witness testimony, and professional mental health records created a compelling case that met their standards for processing claims. The amounts involved, while substantial in total, were within normal ranges for individual companies. Metropolitan Life Insurance processed their claim first, issuing a check for $450,000 within 6 weeks. Pacific Mutual followed 2 weeks later with a payment of $600,000. The remaining companies completed their processing over the following 3 months, with the final payment arriving in August 1989. Thomas had established an intricate system for collecting and laundering the insurance payments. Each shell company maintained separate banking relationships, and the funds were moved through multiple accounts before being converted to cashier's checks and ultimately transferred to offshore accounts he had spent years establishing. The process was designed to create a paper trail so complex that investigators would need months to unravel it completely. By September 1989, Thomas and Michael had successfully collected the full $2.7 million. Michael remained hidden in various safe houses Thomas maintained, while the older man handled all financial transactions and monitored any potential investigative activity. They had achieved what they believed was the perfect crime, a deception so thoroughly planned and executed that discovery seemed impossible. The funeral Thomas arranged for Michael was the final masterstroke of their deception. Held at a small chapel in northeast Portland, the service attracted nearly 60 people, including former co-workers, high school acquaintances, and neighbors who remembered the troubled young man. Michael's parents attended, genuinely grieving for the son they believed they had lost to suicide. Thomas delivered a moving eulogy, describing Michael as a young man who had struggled with demons too powerful for him to overcome. He spoke of Michael's kindness, his creativity, and the tragic circumstances that had led to his desperate final decision. The mourners wept openly as Thomas painted a picture of a life cut short by mental illness and financial despair. The empty casket was lowered into the ground at Riverside Cemetery, with Michael watching from a distance through binoculars. Thomas had selected a burial plot that was visible from a hillside parking area where Michael could observe his own funeral without being detected. The young man later described the experience as surreal and deeply disturbing, watching his parents throw dirt onto a coffin that contained nothing but weighted blankets. For 34 years, Michael Hendricks and Thomas Brennan lived as ghosts, their elaborate deception seemingly bulletproof. They had outsmarted federal investigators, fooled insurance companies worth billions, and created new identities that allowed them to disappear completely. But in the end, it wasn't sophisticated detective work or advanced forensic technology that brought them down. It was a single keystroke error made by an overworked clerk in 1989. When authorities finally arrested both men in 2023, they discovered that the death certificate Thomas had so carefully forged contained a fatal flaw. The clerk he had bribed to create the document had accidentally typed Michael's birth year as 1962 instead of 1961. This seemingly insignificant mistake created an inconsistency with his insurance applications that finally triggered a comprehensive review. One typing error, buried in thousands of pages of documentation, became the thread that unraveled their entire scheme. Thomas Brennan, now 96 years old, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Michael Hendricks received 12 years. The $2.7 million they had stolen was never fully recovered, having been laundered through so many accounts that investigators gave up trying to trace every transaction. Sometimes the most elaborate plans collapse because of the smallest oversights.